So I got this RX 460 a while ago, planning on doing a review, but I was a couple months late and then this came out, the GTX 1050 Ti. So I decided I would eventually get one too and just do a dual review, and it kinda works out how both are from Asus. But honestly, I would have gotten the MSI versions if they were available to me. Now I got different versions for both cards. On the RX 460, I got the beautiful Strix version with a, get this, an ROG RGB LED. Now that's pretty fantastic. Both have two fans and are very small. The 460's fans don't start spinning until you start using it pretty heavily, and it also features an additional 4-pin PWM connector which allows you to set a fan profile based on the GPU's temperature, while the rest of the fans are probably focused on the CPU's temperature. The 1050 Ti unfortunately does not have these features. The 460 requires a 6-pin power adapter, however the 1050 Ti can run perfectly fine off the PCI Express slot, no additional power required. And in my experience, this doesn't affect overclockability. In terms of I/O on the back of the cards, we see DVI, HDMI, and DisplayPort 1.4 on both of them. Now looking at specs, the 460 does have a good number of stream processors versus the number of CUDA cores that the 1050 Ti has. And the GPU clocks are very similar, however the 1050 Ti overclocks much higher, and you'll see that soon. They both have 4GB of GDDR5 memory on a 128-bit memory interface, and the 1050 Ti's memory is clocked slightly higher. The last thing to note is that the 1050 Ti costs a lot more. The 460 4GB version can vary from $110 to $120 and up, while the 1050 Ti starts showing up around $140 and $150. Now I know the GTX 1050 would be a better match in terms of performance to the RX 460, and it does cost about the same as the 4GB 460s. When I get my hands on one, I'll be sure to compare all three in benchmarks. Now I'm testing both these cards, including the last gen cards, such as the GTX 950 and the R7360, which I've done reviews of both, only on the first three titles though. For the system, I'll be using i5 4670K at 4.6 GHz, and 16GB of 1600 MHz Patriot memory. The rest of the specs will be in the description if you're really curious. I should also mention that the 460 has been overclocked to 1300 MHz, while the 1050 Ti to 1810 MHz. These two new cards are both overclocked because I'd always recommend if you have a budget card, you should always overclock for more performance. Oh yeah, and all games will be running at 1080p. I'll also only be showing minimums and averages. First, on Tomb Raider at ultimate settings, we see that both Nvidia cards beat out the RX 460, and the GTX 1050 Ti is even almost pulling 70 FPS on average. On Bioshock Infinite, we see a very similar story where both Nvidia cards beat out both AMD cards. I know this graph says Bioshock Infinite, but I promise it's Shadow of Mordor on very high settings. And finally, the RX 460 is ahead of the GTX 1050, but the 1050 Ti is still way ahead. On GTA 5, we see the RX 460 doing all right at high settings, while the 1050 delivers a very smooth gameplay. On Rise of the Tomb Raider, the GTX 1050 Ti gets almost 60 FPS minimum, while the 460 gets less than that on average. On Thief, the averages were actually very close on both cards, however the 460 manages to get less than 30 FPS minimum. Now the 460 was introduced as a budget way to play esports and MOBAs, and the only one of those I play is CSGO, so I did run that. And on max settings, it's not just getting playable, or 60 FPS, but you can actually pair this with a 120Hz monitor and be good, and that's great. Something I did notice on both cards, however, is that the game seems laggy or like locked at 30 FPS or something. Until you turn a setting down, turn it back on, and then it'll run smooth. Lastly, the temps here show that the RX 460 is much hotter. However, the fans are always spinning on the 1050 Ti, while they only starts to spin on the 460 once it gets hot enough. In conclusion, neither of these cards are bad options for a budget system, and I love the idea of gaming getting cheaper and cheaper. Now, again, I would love to get my hands on a GTX 1050 and compare all three of these cards. For now, I can say that these are not bad values, especially if you can get one on sale for close to $100. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.